So it's not just, hey, I want to lose 20 pounds, right? I think a lot of people want to lose a little bit of weight. But part of it is not just, hey, I want to lose weight. It's really, am I willing to exercise more? Am I willing to change my diet? Am I willing to make those trade-offs that are linked to what I want to be and what I want to get to?
Hello and welcome to the ALU podcast, Entrepreneur Leadership in Africa, where we explore more on being a bold entrepreneur leader. I'm your host, Savannah Olo, and today I have with me Paul Nselel. Paul is the president and CEO of AgReliant and has quite the rapport once you listen to his journey from the likes of Lehman Brothers and Nike. He has acquired a broad, successful experience across industries, yet focused on ag, biotech, and food for the past 12 plus years. Listening to this episode, you'll note a few things. He's charismatic, strategic, a performance-oriented leader, and with exceptional interpersonal skills. Most importantly, what do you think the landscape of agribusiness looks like in Africa? And how do we empower people to compete at higher margins? Well, stay tuned and know it all. Join us as we uncover a whole new world from our diverse community of entrepreneur leaders. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Paul Nselel. So, thank you, Paul, for being with us today. The AOE podcast has been anticipating you quite today because you have a very, very busy schedule. So, tell us more about yourself and, why you chose to be in the field that you're in.
Also, I'm actually originally from Cameroon.
Right.
The country that is great in football, and but from the French-speaking part of the country, and that's where I spent most of my childhood. My dad is an agronomist and worked in one of the largest producing company over there in Cameroon, exporting bananas and pineapple primarily to Europe. And so when I finished my high school, I basically had a scholarship, as most good students in Cameroon back then, to go study in France. And I studied math in undergrad and then math in my first graduate degree, and started my career in investment banking in Europe. Right. And then after a few years, decided to do my MBA at Wharton, which I did. Joined Lehman in New York, spent a little bit of time there, then a little bit of time at Nike. And joining Monsanto in the ag sector came a little bit as it was an occurrence of randomness. They were looking for people who had good experience in consumer goods to help them improve their brand. So that's how I joined. And so I joined in a field that I knew fairly well, so marketing and strategy. I had the opportunity to then go to Eastern Europe to help her run the business in Russia and Ukraine. And then from then, it just took off. I came back to the US to run the eastern part of the country and had increasing levels of responsibility, up to the point where I became chief commercial officer of a small publicly traded company with responsibility over the 65 countries where we were selling. And so I was just named very recently the president and CEO of AgReliant, which is the third largest seed company in North America. And I've been in the job for a month. The reason I like what I'm doing and the reason I like this field is because, feeding a growing population is a real problem for mankind. So that's point number one. Point number two, I think farmers all around the world, they may have different technologies and different tools, but they have the same outlook in life. Farming is not just a profession and a job, it's a lifestyle. And the idea that I'm helping farmers and that this company that I'm working for is helping farmers is something that I find very attractive. And then finally, as a native African, it's something that I think is just food security in general is something that is always going to be important to me.
Right. So mentioning that, and that it's remarkable hearing your journey from, how you started and how you are up to where you are right now. In your opinion, what are the major challenges facing the agribusiness sector that needs addressing?
So, I mean, if you just think about it, if you think about it just here in North America, there is about 40% of corn grain that goes to ethanol. And ethanol
Right.
is basically fuel for car and the rest, right? So if you look at where we are today with COVID-19 and reduced mobility, people traveling less, driving less, so there is less consumption of fuel, therefore less demand for corn and the rest. And that is putting pressure on commodity prices. That is then, in turn, reducing the profitability of farmers and really putting the onus on us to be providing advice and helping farmer drive more productivity to be able to do well, right? So that's one big element that is very sort of like topical right now. The
Right.
other element in one of the crops that is important to us, which is soybean, is the fact that the two largest producers in the world of soybean are basically Brazil and the US. Obviously, I know you guys are all familiar with the issue of trade with China, and about 40% of US soybean goes to China. So with limited access to export, that is also pressure on commodity price. And then when you broaden that to the world and the developing world in particular, when you think about Africa, you think about some parts of Southeast Asia or Central America, I think the problem then is really divided in two, right? So you have large commercial farmers that you can find in places like South Africa, some pockets of Kenya, Zambia, and more in places like Nigeria, where those guys are going to have similar issues than North America, maybe with an added sort of component of infrastructure, right? And currency. And then you have sort of the smallholder who tend to be more subsistence driven. And the issue there is going to be, how do we help those folks, we as an industry, help those folks get access to quality input to be able to improve the yield and the productivity of their farms, right? So that's kind of what I see there.
Okay, great. And it's amazing how you have been able to break that down. I've never looked at it from that perspective. So thank you so much for that. So in many countries, most crops are produced by small-sized farms with limited mechanization and capacity, leading to poor yields. Fragmented markets, price controls, and poor infrastructures also hamper production. So how can small-scale farmers transition to commercial agriculture?
You know, a lot of it is a system, right? And there are a lot of creative things that have been done in different parts of the world. I know, for example, in India, and I believe in some pockets in Africa, the advance of technology around, phone technology in general, it's something that has enabled input company to provide more targeted advice to farmer. And what do I mean by that? I think primarily about the ability to, and the process, the way you usually worked is you had a code that you typed on your phone, and that enabled geolocalization, and that geolocalization then we would be able to understand, the meteorological conditions around the farmer and be able to advise them as to when to plant, potentially some of those elements, right? Just the agronomy part of it. So there is just the process of planting and growing and all that I think we have technology today that can enable doing that piece better. So that's one. I think the second one is, inevitably the piece about accessing quality input is also linked to financing, right?
Right.
And I think there is a whole conversation around whether it is an element of pledging the grain to have access to input, or I think we have to collectively figure out a way to provide quality input to those farmers, because that would really improve their yield. Again, for context, if you take some of the highly productive land in Ukraine or in central Iowa, you could get to a productivity level that is close to 16 to 20 tons of corn per hectare, right? And when you look at the yields in Africa or even in Southeast Asia, it's not uncommon to see people consistently below 5 tons per hectare, or even sometimes around 2 tons. And that's a huge amount that is left on the table that would really then have consequences around the ability of those farmers to honestly even finance, things that would then enable the kids of that farmer to have a better outlook on life, right? Education, and all of the rest. So that's sort of like the second item. And then the third item in my mind, and this relates more to produce, has to do with elements of infrastructure, right? I think over time, the cold chain creates a huge amount of waste, or the absence of cold chain creates a huge amount of waste. And if you think about what is produced versus what is consumed, I think the statistic is something like 1/3 to 40% of what is produced is actually being wasted and not being consumed. Some of it is the absence of cold chain and the transit, and a lot of it in the developed world is at the consumption table, where people buy more than they really need and never really consume that. So I think there is another axis of resolution there. So those three pieces: access to input and financing linked to that, advice and leveraging technology. And then the last part is the cold chain and infrastructure part of it. That's how I see that.
This podcast is brought to you by Venture by ALU, a free course for entrepreneurs. Do you want to know how to overcome entrepreneurial challenges from real-life experiences? Well, Venture is an online course designed for young and aspiring entrepreneurs. It features more than 10 ALU entrepreneur leaders who will guide and inspire young entrepreneurs. You can find Venture on venture.alueducation.com. Once again, venture.alueducation.com. Venture, a course for entrepreneurs by entrepreneurs. Now back to our conversation. Great, and I'll just follow up from there. You've talked about a lot of exports to like China and what have you, but as an African native myself as well, we've seen like there's a lot of importation of crops or subsidized foods, and what do you think would be the best? What would you think would be the best practice to have to sort of reduce the importation of food and have local farmers more empowered and more encouraged to sell their product within their countries or within the continent itself?
Yeah, and I have a certain bias here, and I'm not trying to tell necessarily folks everywhere around the world what to do. But, so it's my individual sort of like opinion, right? I think in a lot of places around the world, folks have some level of suspicion around like GMO. They have suspicion of some level of technology. And I think really understanding and accessing technology is something that is really important. Yes. And in fact, and I, again, this may be, this may not be something that is necessarily very popular, but if you think about what the advance of technology does, it actually reduces the level of pesticides used in nature, right? Because when you start take the example of cotton, right? And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that BT cotton was authorized for planting in Kenya recently. It had been in the past in Burkina Faso. That may have changed. But really what that does is it really reduces significantly the amount of pesticide that is being poured over the plant, and really the exposure that, generally farming is a family activity in some of those areas of the world, the exposure that significant swath of the population are having using those pesticides. So, I think one avenue is definitely the technology piece, right? And there is really no way, to produce more if you don't have better breeding, better genetics, and access to quite frankly, elements of GMO, right? The other part of it is, being quite intentional. I think historically there's been countries in Africa that have done quite a good job in, you look at how some of the West African countries like Ivory Coast and others have had a very deliberate policy around cocoa and became extremely influential in the amount and of production that is coming out of those countries in those crops, right? So, it's really about being intentional. I think there is a reservoir of talent, activity, will, and it's just bringing some of those together and making decision along those lines. At least that would be my opinion.
Right. So, okay, just further into that, a lot of sub-Saharan African countries are ill-equipped to meet its food requirements. So how can we have more African produce compete with higher margins? Like, aside from having access to a certain extent of GMOs or the technologies or, even the knowledge, some of them don't have access to these things. So how can we enable them to have access to these resources in order for them to compete with higher margins?
I think some of those are commercial policies, right, and trade policies that the countries are putting in place. And if you think about, and I'm speaking just very generically, right? If I speak very generically, if you take any large company today, South Africa is a significant market when it comes to row crops, and South Africa obviously allows for pretty much a significant amount of technology. I think there is a lot of acreage of corn in Tanzania, quite a bit in Kenya between the hills and the valley. Zambia is has significant elements, and then when you go to the northern part of Africa, you have a lot more around citrus and limited apple, and so I guess the logic of it for me is, it's a step by step. So it's how do we, how do the countries have a policy that invites companies to have a reciprocal interest to be able to have significant activities there and start rolling the ball, right? And at least historically, and I haven't kept up very recently with all of the legislation, historically, it's been difficult to have those setups, particularly because the regulatory system in certain countries is not always established, not enabling companies to go and start selling, right? So there has to be a regulatory framework that allows for that. So and I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but some of those elements are policy driven.
Okay. You've answered it to a certain extent. I could understand how somebody could, maybe interpret it in a different way. But seeing as this is the ALU podcast, we talk about entrepreneurial leadership in Africa and, encourage people to be bold entrepreneurial leaders. Say a 20-year-old is starting a business in the agriculture industry. What advice would you give them getting into this industry or starting, or, what key things would you encourage them to keep in mind as they go through their journey?
I think my advice are probably going to be in two broad buckets, right? I think the first bucket in my mind is really an element about believing in oneself, right? I think, and this really doesn't necessarily just is not necessarily restricted only to agriculture or to entrepreneurship, but I think there is an element of you have to have a belief of what you can do and what you can be, right? And when I was coming to study in Europe, I had a conversation with my grandfather, and he said something to the effect of, when you wake up every morning and you look at the mirror, you have to be okay with what you see. So there is a level of comfort about oneself and a level of comfort about one's ambition that has to be there. And that has to be there in good and bad times. And there has to be a belief that it can happen, right? And that's a really, really important part, right? And the second part of it, and by the way, that belief then has to be linked to, the trade-off and the commitment that the individual is ready to make, right? So it's not just, hey, I want to lose 20 pounds, right? I think a lot of people want to lose a little bit of weight, maybe not Alex. Alex looks like a very good looking, slim guy, right? But but part of it is not just, hey, I want to lose weight. Is really, am I willing to exercise more? Am I willing to change my diet? Am I willing to make those trade-offs that are linked to what I want to be and what I want to get to, right? So that's the one whole piece, right? And then the other piece is, being informed and understanding what the industry is about, understanding what it takes, and there's a whole network of, African and non-Africans who are very interested in the industry on the continent, and leveraging those relationships and being willing to take a risk, right? I understand the fact that it's a very generic answer, but I think a lot of it has to do with belief and willingness to make some trade-offs.
Right. I feel like that's the kind of advice that I needed today, to be very honest with you. Thank you so much for that. Well, Paul, this marks the end of the episode. It's been amazing having you on here. You've been very candid and very open, and, you've been able to express your thoughts and feelings on the agribusiness in Africa. Thank you so much for that. We hope to see you soon once again if you'd like to join a podcast. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
And that was Paul Nselel, strategic planner at Nike, president and CEO of AgReliant, giving us very important advice and his 2, if not 10 cents on the agribusiness on the continent. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. You can find us on Spotify, Anchor, and Apple Podcasts for exclusive access to all the gems of knowledge we drop here. Remember to subscribe to this podcast on your preferred platform. This is the AOU podcast, Entrepreneur Leadership in Africa, real stories, real experiences.